Before South Carolina can contend for a national championship late next weekend, they got to deal with the NC State Wolfpack in the Final Four, a team that, from a number standpoint, is quite similar to the Gamecocks.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and you can always find my written work over on Gamecock Digest on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. We are officially now done with the Elite Eight. We are now looking ahead to the Final Four in the NCAA Women's Basketball Tournament. And that is all we're going to be talking about on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Gamecocks. At the end of the show, we're going to talk a little bit about the action that took place last night between Iowa and LSU and what Caitlin Clark proved in that matchup. But before we get into that, we're going to start off this show by talking about South Carolina's matchup against the NC State Wolfpack that will take place later this week on Friday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And I was diving into some of the numbers on Monday morning and looking at some of these numbers. NC State and South Carolina, they are quite similar in many aspects, particularly when it comes to a lot of things that apply to the defensive side of the floor. So, in terms of numbers, let's start out with the average height for both of these teams. And to keep it simple, I basically just took the average height for the starting five for both South Carolina and NC State. When you look at the average height for South Carolina's starters stand at an average height of about 6 foot 0.8 inches tall. So basically right around 6'1". NC State's starters, their average height is around 6 foot 1.2 inches tall. So again, if you want to round down, 6'1" basically. So both of these teams pretty much neck and neck, literally and figuratively speaking, in terms of their overall height. Now, let's look at field goal percentage defense. Obviously, defense has been a calling card for South Carolina over the past several years now, and that is the case once again this year for the Gamecocks, as they are holding their opponents to an average shooting percentage of 32.1%, which is the best mark in all of Division I women's college basketball. However, NC State is not too far behind South Carolina in this regard, as they hold their opponents to an average shooting percentage of 35.9%, which I believe is just 3.8 percentage points higher than South Carolina. That ranks 12th in the country. So top 15 right there with South Carolina. And then you look at fouls committed per game. South Carolina averages about 14.1 fouls per game on their part, which is the 32nd best mark in Division I women's college basketball, while NC State only averages around 12.7 fouls per game, which is 5th in the country. So both of these teams, when you just look at the numbers, they both, from a physical and tangible standpoint, are going to match up quite well with one another. Both teams are pretty doggone disciplined, and they make it pretty tough for their opponent to score points. Now, I don't know NC State's offensive numbers off the top of my head. I did look at some of those already, but the point here is this. This is strength versus strength here. South Carolina's offense, obviously, you could probably say is better compared to NC State's offense, but defensively speaking, both of these teams are elite squads in several different aspects. So do not be surprised if this game is a bit lower scoring on Friday night. Do not be shocked if South Carolina maybe does not run away with this game. And I mean, heck, NC State, they've been on a very good run in this tournament. So because it's the Final Four now, you should expect this to not be a runaway game. But the Wolfpack, you look at the team, the first thing that stands out to them or with them is their defensive play. However, there is one area, there is one facet of the Wolfpack's game that is a weakness, one that South Carolina's women's basketball team could take advantage of this coming Friday. I'll talk about that one area in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you need to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team both faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals worldwide, which makes it the best place to hire because it gives you access to professionals that you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all of that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours when they use LinkedIn Jobs. So why continue to wait? Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free today. Terms and conditions do apply. Welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. Now, when you look at South Carolina, I think it's pretty clear that they are the most well-rounded team in Division I women's college basketball this season. South Carolina has got the offense that can attack you in a variety of different ways. South Carolina still has a great defense, an elite defense that can also hold you to low point totals, or at least below your scoring average. And South Carolina also is still a great rebounding team. Maybe not quite as good as they were a year ago, but still near the top of the country in that regard. And I think that rebounding is going to be the one area where South Carolina could really impose their will on the NC State Wolfpack in this Final Four matchup. When looking at the numbers, South Carolina has grabbed 1,664 rebounds to this point in the season. That is the best mark in all women's college basketball. Conversely, the NC State Wolfpack, despite ranking 41st in the country in rebounding margin, with an average rebounding margin of plus 5.8 rebounds per game, the Wolfpack has allowed their opponents to grab 1,371 boards total this season. That is the worst mark in all of Division I women's college basketball. As a matter of fact, it's about 100 rebounds more than the second place team in that statistical category, that being Troy. So, for South Carolina going into this game, even though NC State seems to match up well with South Carolina on paper, just in terms of their overall length and height, it appears that NC State is not always the best in terms of maybe boxing out, maybe in terms of getting to a loose ball or a long rebound. This is an area where South Carolina, in my opinion, could separate themselves in this game. And you could split it up between offensive and defensive rebounding. We'll start off with offensive rebounding. When we talk about that, the first player that comes to mind, obviously, is Camila Cardoso. Not just because she's 6'7", but because she moves quite well for her 6'7" frame. Now, NC State does have a pretty tall center in their own right in River Baldwin, who I believe, based on their roster numbers, is 6'5". So only a 2-inch difference there between River Baldwin and Camila Cardoso. But as we've all seen plenty of times, Cardoso, she has got a very high motor for her position and for her overall length and height. So I think that this is a game where Camila could absolutely dominate on the offensive boards. I think that NC State, they might actually get to a point later in the game where they might have to try to send 2 people over to her to try to box her out and maybe give themselves a better chance of getting more defensive rebounds. On the other side of the floor, when it comes to defensive rebounds, I think that this could be another Ashlyn Watkins type game where she just is all over the place in terms of the defensive glass. We saw this against Oregon State this past Sunday in the Elite Eight. Heck, it was a big reason why South Carolina won that game. And Watkins said after the game that going into it, she had made a promise to Dawn Staley that she was going to give more effort, that she was going to basically leave it all out there on the floor, because I guess maybe she felt like that she had left a little bit out there in the Sweet 16, or maybe some foul trouble kind of prevented her from being able to make quite the impact that she can when she is on the floor for South Carolina. So I think that Watkins, this is going to be another game where she, again, is going to be able to run all over the place. And, this is not meant any offense to NC State, because I would say this for probably any team that faces South Carolina, but I'm pretty sure that they do not have anyone in their front court that can match the athleticism that Ashlyn Watkins possesses in terms of explosiveness, in terms of speed, in terms of her lower body explosiveness, being able to jump up as high as she can. I think that this is a game where you're going to see Camila Cardoso potentially get a double-double, and Ashlyn Watkins, if she doesn't get a double-double, I think she gets double-digit rebounds. That's what I see playing out in this game. Again, just looking at the numbers. I get it. NC State could all of a sudden put together their best rebounding game of the season, and that's all they would have to do to try to win and defeat South Carolina, knock them out of the tournament. But it's tough to see that happening when this has been a trend all season long for this squad. So as close as this game could be at times, I think the separator in this game is going to be rebounding for South Carolina. Now, last night obviously was a big night in women's college basketball. Had two big-time games on the other side of the bracket, one between Iowa and LSU, and the other one between UConn and Southern Cal. We're going to talk about that Iowa-LSU game a little bit, and more so why Caitlin Clark basically proved that she is unstoppable in the sense that you cannot keep her constrained for an entire 40 minutes. We'll talk about that and how that could apply to South Carolina if that rematch does take place in a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is also brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is what brings home the winning trophy and also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. All right, to wrap up today's show, let's talk a little bit about what happened between Iowa and LSU on Monday night. And what basically happened was Caitlin Clark just went off against the LSU Tigers. LSU, I think, honestly, had control of this game at the end of the first quarter, but it seemed like once Angel Reese sort of re-aggravated that same ankle, or at least rolled one of her ankles early in the second quarter, that it just was not the same for LSU from that point on. You combine that with the head-scratching lack of adjustments from Kim Mulkey defensively in terms of putting Haley Van Lith on Caitlin Clark and not switching defenders, not putting a Flau'jae Johnson on her. It was pretty much a wrap from that point on in favor of the Hawkeyes. And in terms of Caitlin Clark and what she did last night and how South Carolina fans should interpret this if they do get that rematch in the national championship game, here's what I'll say. Again, Caitlin Clark is quite literally one of those players that you just cannot stop. As one of the LSU players put it going to the game, you can only hope to contain her. It's probably the best way to describe Caitlin Clark as a superstar. Now, here's where I'm going with all of this. This is a little bit of a minor preview if that matchup takes place. I think with Caitlin Clark, The thing that you have to do is you have to just resign yourself to the fact that you're not going to be able to shut off everything for her. But you do have to figure out, how do you want to defend her? What is the one area that you want to take away? You see this a lot more now in modern basketball because a lot of these players are so skilled offensively. And obviously, the very tippity top, the one percenters, they are some of the best that we have seen in the sport's history from an offensive skill set standpoint, that you're not going to be able to stop them. So what should South Carolina do with Caitlin Clark? In my opinion, South Carolina, and I can't believe I'm saying this honestly, they need to just try and force her to jack up threes the entire ball game. If they play her, I think that UConn should do this as well when they play Iowa in the 9 o'clock slot in the Final Four on Friday night. But with Caitlin Clark, I think that she has taken her game to a point where she is actually more dangerous when she is driving to the basket than she is just taking these leaning fadeaway jump shot threes from behind the arc. The reason why is this. When a player drives to the basket, there are three outcomes that they can have, especially if you're Caitlin Clark. One outcome is she drives to the basket, she gets an easy 2 points. The second outcome is maybe she dishes it off to a front court player who has her defender leave to try to help the defender that's been just completely blown past by Caitlin Clark. And then you draw a foul, and maybe they get an and one, which is just a cherry on top at that point. And then the third outcome is this. Clark runs into the paint. Somebody on the wing or in the corner kind of leaves their person alone too much, gives them too much space. Clark sees it and kicks it out last second to the corner, and her teammate gets a wide open 3-point shot. And as Iowa has proven this year, listen, we can all agree, if they didn't have Caitlin Clark, they would probably barely even be a contender for the NCAA tournament, okay? We all can agree on that. But Iowa does have some decent shooters on this team. Kate Martin is one of them. Gabby Marshall, who played against South Carolina last year, is another one as well. And they also, I want to say, have Sydney Olofter. I want to say that's her last name. I may have totally just butchered it, but she also is a solid 3-point shooter as well. Point being, Iowa has a bevy of perimeter shooters that they can rely on. And so, if I'm Don Staley and this coaching staff, and I watched this game on Monday night, making mental notes and doing some scouting in case you do play them in the national championship game, the thing that I would think about is, what area of the game do we want to shut off in order to limit Caitlin Clark's options as much as possible? And I think if that matchup happens in the national championship game, what you have to do is you have to basically close off the driving lanes completely. You cannot allow Caitlin Clark to just run on into the driving lane and give her all these different options in terms of how she wants to attack you. Now, that does not mean, of course, that I'm saying you should also trap or hard hedge to the point where you leave a Hannah Stalkey, the center for Iowa, wide open in the paint. And then we see a repeat of last year, which is just either Caitlin's putting a shot up or she's just throwing it over everybody's head to the center who's getting an easy breakaway layup. That was ridiculous last year. And if it happens again, quite frankly, it's a coaching failure. I'm just going to say that, okay? As good as Caitlin Clark is, you can't let her beat you that way again for the second season in a row. But if you're South Carolina, in my opinion, you need to encourage Caitlin Clark to basically take all the threes that she wants. Don't give her open 3-pointers, but basically fight as hard as you can through the screens. Rotate Raven Johnson and Malaysia Fulwiley, and they're constantly a point guard. I'm not even going to say move Bree Hall over to Caitlin Clark to cover her, because Bree Hall, again, they've got good enough perimeter shooters. You can't just put Malaysia Fulwiley or Raven Johnson on, say, Kay Martin, who I believe is also 6 foot. Height-wise, it's not going to make a difference. I think you got to roll with your point guards if this matchup happens and basically just tell them, scrap and fight as hard as you have in any game all season and hope for the best. And then offensively, obviously, you have to come into this game with an understanding. Hold on. See, I'm already doing it. I'm already acting like this game's going to happen, and I know I shouldn't. I apologize for making y'all freak out about that a little bit and maybe acting like it's a jinx. But if South Carolina plays Iowa, you should go into that game with an understanding that you're going to have to score some points offensively. You can't go out there and hope to score 65 and win. I think that you got to at least put up 70 to 75. That's the minimum. If you put up less than that, then we could indeed see a repeat of last year. And again, if that matchup happens, everybody and their mother outside of the state of South Carolina is going to pretty much be pulling for Caitlin Clark. And look, she doesn't deserve hate for all the good that she's done for the sport, how much she has elevated the sport in terms of perception. She's done a lot of great things for the game. She has. But you know that ESPN's going to want her to win. You know that in terms of calls, listen, I know last year, South Carolina fans were not happy with some of the calls that were levied against some of the Gamecocks players in that matchup. You would hope that doesn't happen again this time around, and maybe this set of officials will let the teams play and, quite frankly, just not give anyone a bunch of fouls. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I know I am. But I don't want to just spend this whole show talking about just NC State. As good of a team as they are, we also have to pay attention to what's happening on the other side of the bracket between Iowa and UConn. So just have that be your main takeaway for Caitlin Clark. It's, once again, pick your poison. But this year, it's to an even stronger degree, in my opinion, than it was the case this past year when South Carolina was getting ready to play them in the Final Four. Before I get even more ahead of myself with that game, I'm just going to go ahead and say that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Hope that y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are y'all's initial thoughts on this matchup between South Carolina and NC State? Is there an area that you think that South Carolina could exploit that maybe doesn't even involve rebounding? And lastly, what were your opinions on what happened between Iowa and LSU last night in the Elite Eight? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or you could shoot me a direct message on X at @aline_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. And once again, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.